Hello, my name is Greg Madison, and this is The Living Process. And on this episode, I'm in conversation with Christian Dillo. Christian is a fascinating Zen teacher, although you'll hear in our conversation that he doesn't readily label himself as a teacher, although he is the resident teacher at Boulder Zen Center. But there's a real kind of aliveness, I think, in this conversation where we talk a little bit about his practice, how he came across focusing, and how he recognized himself in Gendlin's description of the focusing process, how he already knew enough to kind of pause and find the right word when he was trying to not lose himself, I guess, in his interactions with others. In the conversation, we talk quite a bit about the similarities in practice, the Zen practice that he describes and the focusing practice that he knows and that I also describe, and also some of the differences and how it could be useful for both his community and the focusing community to have a little bit more of what the other community emphasizes. I don't think I want to say too much more than that, but it was a very, for me, very engaging conversation. And at the end, we do express a desire to keep in contact, and I would really welcome that. So I hope you enjoy this conversation with Christian Dillo and The Living Process. So welcome, Christian. I've really been looking forward to this. I feel very uncertain where our conversation might go because I've never met you before. But what I normally ask people to begin with is just, how did you come across focusing and Gendlin's work? Curious about that.
Yeah. Already have to do a little focusing here.
Mm-hmm. Good.
Well, it comes out of a particular life situation in my early 20s. And the context isn't so much, oh, I'm studying psychotherapy or this is coming to me as a method.
Yeah.
But it's coming out of my own situation and my own existential crisis. Like, I'm noticing that life doesn't have the same kind of depth when I'm using my intellect, just stringing concepts together in a way that makes sense to other people. And then I pretend to myself that it also makes sense to me. And I'm weaving a sense of identity and who I am and what I want to be from these concepts that string themselves together. And it feels like just a kind of social and cultural conditioning. So I feel that there was a process in my life that led to a sense of, not being in touch with myself, having lost myself in some way. And then it's also true that that was never the case, because the search for, a different kind of being in touch with myself, a different kind of meaning making, is already a sense that that touch isn't fully lost, and something. So, and this goes back into my teenage years, and then when I started to become explicit, I made the decision to explicitly study language and in relationship to the body. then Gendlin just kind of like popped up. And then I was delighted to find an articulation and a set of concepts that were already describing something that I was dealing with, and to a large extent already experiencing, but not being able to articulate on my own. So then there's a lot of excitement for me. It's like, well, here, this is exactly what I'm feeling and thinking about.
So let me just say some of that back to you. I think it's very common that many of us who have come into the focusing world in some way, to some extent, start from something in our own lived experience. I think even people like myself who maybe take a therapeutic training and find it there as well, we only pick it up and continue with it because it resonates with something that we know from our lives. So I think that's really common. I think it's interesting as well that it grabs those people for whom it touches something that was missing. And it sounds like, again, another experience that I can certainly relate to, that conceptualizing can leave underneath it a kind of an emptiness. Other people may be convinced by what you're saying, but you know inside of yourself it's somehow not touching home or something. And when you came across Gendlin's work, there was something in the way that he was putting experience into words that it didn't leave the body behind.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I've discovered on my own how to not leave the body behind, and finding Gendlin's work was actually confirming that my method was correct. Because I write about that in my book too, is like that as a teenager, I was an awkward person in the sense that I paused in ways that were not, socially conform.
Yeah.
It's like I would wait and see what I really wanted to say, and it would take the time that it took. And so I had a reputation for, making these weird pauses that were not quite right. But then, discovering Gendlin's work and felt sense and attending to the felt sense and letting it come and letting myself carry the situation forward from that pause just confirmed that I had intuitively, found something.
Mhm.
So in that sense, it wasn't so much that Gendlin was a revelation, which in many ways it also was, but also a confirmation of
Yeah.
something that I had, discovered on my own.
Yes. Yeah. I can understand that. For me, coming across Gendlin was also a confirmation, and it helped me that there was someone in authority, like this professor, that said it was okay to do what you were doing or to pay attention to what you knew was there. But I'm curious with you, it's like even as a teenager, how did you persevere? Were you encouraged to continue to pause in the way you were doing and waiting for the right word to come? How did you, yeah,
No, it was just an inner knowing that the price for not doing it was too high.
okay.
The price would be some sort of alienation or dissociation that I saw in other people, and I had a sense of deeply not wanting that. But that also meant there was also a not knowing of how to avoid it, and so the awkwardness of the pausing came out of that tension.
Hmm. And somehow when you came across focusing, it confirmed what you were doing. But my understanding, having looked at some of your things online, is that it remains, although integrated into other things, it remains quite a core way of expressing yourself, understanding your experience. Is that right?
What is the it that you're naming there as it?
This emphasis on prioritizing your own, if you want to call it authenticity, and speaking from your experience of living and not being satisfied with ways of talking that leave that behind, that somehow that sort of whole way of being has remained core for you?
Yeah, yeah, very important. As I think you were implying, integrated in other,
Yeah.
I don't even know what the word is here. Orientations, explorations. Authenticity is an extremely difficult word for me.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think I know what you mean. And so from that, I would say, yes, it is about authenticity. And then I think the ways authenticity as a word is used in our current contemporary culture is also problematic and kind of flat, even. It's like this kind of authenticity that I think we both mean here isn't about what feels good to me, right now, and as if this was about satisfying some shallow desire of this or that sort.
Mm-hmm.
This kind of authenticity, if we want to start using the word differently in a wider sense, always implies others. It implies, if I think this more with Gendlin's vocabulary, it always implies the whole situation. It's in that sense, it is actually not about self. It's about something that transcends self and other, and it is the situation as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
And then if authenticity means how does the situation want to use me to be carried forward in the right way, then I think we're talking about an authenticity that is different from what, most people understand right away when it's like, I want to live an authentic life. But anyway, it has these layers. And I find that I'm digging deeper there, deeper and deeper, deeper than I did when I was 16, or.
I'm curious about that. I agree. Authenticity can be used in very many different ways, and probably increasingly in this day and age in quite a superficial way, and even be an argument for being self-centered or something. But I'm curious, when you talk about authenticity as implying the whole situation and not just what I might want in the situation as though I exist separate from it, but what the situation might require of me, that authenticity then becomes some kind of a process. And maybe it's even a question, does that process originate in the self, whatever we mean by that, or does it originate someplace else?
Yeah, it neither originates in the self nor somewhere else. It's just like to force the question into that contradiction is, I think, wrong. Or it's misleading because it implies that I have to make a decision between one or the other. It is, that's because I'm a Buddhist practitioner. That is the whole notion of non-self, is like, it's not like that there's no self, but it's just like that we get trapped in this contradiction between self and other, or self and the world, or self and the situation, as if there was an original division between the two. But to give a really silly example, is like if you fly in an airplane with a pilot and the pilot decides to be authentic and share, and I mean this now in this like superficial way, share everything he or she feels and, what he or she might want or not want to do while sitting in the cockpit, the passengers would be quite uncomfortable. It's like, why are you telling us this? This is, just do your job. And so their authenticity can come into a contradistinction with professionalism, right? It's like, for example, teachers, if you're in a classroom, you want to be authentic with your students. Well, do the students really need your authenticity of like what you're feeling, what your emotions are, what your personal life is, and so forth, if authenticity means also that? Well, you have a job to do. It's like, let the situation tell you what is appropriate in this, what is an appropriate action or response in this situation. So sometimes what we call the self has to be set aside in order to meet the situation appropriately. So, but you can never leave yourself out of the situation. So implicitly, everything that's going on for you will also influence what you're capable of at this time, or what, feels right to do. So it's a tricky territory to puzzle out conceptually, but I don't think that in the actual living process it's complicated. It can be quite obvious, what you need to engage or not engage at any given time.
Those are interesting examples. I guess I'm most interested in situations where we pause, like we're doing now in our conversation, and we sense a little bit the interaction between us, as well as what's happening in me and what's happening in you, because we're not the same. And then the question for me does arise, how would you, do you have language for that doesn't immediately import some kind of a separation between self and situation?
Yeah, I speak of undivided activity.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Every situation, we could even say every person, every being, every object is an undivided activity. So as soon as we think of it as a separate activity, I mean, activity is already a reframing of objectness, personhood, to know that it's an activity or a process. And it's undivided from all other activities and processes that we could delineate and separate out. So to cultivate a feeling that this is always an undivided field of activity, I mean, we can supercharge this with more stuff and say it's an undivided field of interactivity, or it's like or I think Gendlin has used the word imperfection, yeah, so this, to think of undividedness rather than oneness, for example, which, some spiritual traditions might want to talk about oneness. Oneness is too much. Not two-ness, undividedness, is not the same as oneness.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, so that reminds me, some of Gendlin's terms, interaffecting, unseparated multiplicity, interaction first, I think are pointing at the same kind of territory in some way. But in that case, I like the term. I think it's very useful. what is, I don't know how to ask this in a way that doesn't already presume the wrong answer, but
Yeah, that's nice.
how, what's the status of the self in that sort of undivided activity or interactivity or whatever?
Yeah, I don't quite know what status means here. So you
Yeah,
have to say more um, about what you're really asking about.
yeah, exactly. The word status was wrong, but I was struggling to find um, I don't exactly know how to ask the question, but it's something as simple as, even in the way you say it, it's not about oneness. There
Hmm.
are, you and I are individuals, whatever that means. And I guess that's the question. And we're not separate individuals, even through this medium. There's an interaction between us, there's some kind of an energetic connection and responsiveness, even if we're not in the same room. Somehow that happens. But what is it that keeps us from being a oneness? Like, what is this, the self of you and I? How do you
Yeah, well,
understand that? Yeah.
my habit is to avoid metaphysical questions. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't pretend that I really know about ontology, let's say.
Okay.
I just don't deal in ontology as much as possible. It's like so, and I feel my approach is, very pragmatic. It's like about what is a good, beneficial uh, next step that is possible in any process and meaningful and and beneficial in that territory. Um, so maybe maybe we can look at very simple situations like if we were one, does that mean I could ask you to pay my bills? I mean, literally my financial bills and also my, you know, moral bills, maybe. Like, could you do that for me? And then we find out, no, this is just not the case. It's like you are not paying my bills and I'm not paying your bills.
Mhm.
So there's some separateness that we need to acknowledge um, and live. I mean, this also has, you also not going to the toilet for me, and you're not eating for me, and so that's also a separateness. So, like, I look at the self as a fundamental situation in which I need to take care of certain things and have responsibility for aspects of my existential situation that cannot be done by someone else. Um, you're also not going to die for me, or like if we want to be existential, or so there is some kind of individuality there from which a lot follows, and it's like it's almost impossible to spell out everything that follows from it, but I think we can honestly feel
Yeah.
it's necessary for each individual to take care of themselves.
Yes. And for me, an example of that is even in a conversation. If one person smiles or laughs, it's not just arbitrary that that it's that person that smiles or laughs.
Mhm.
It's not like it could as easily have been the other person. And it's just by chance, it's that person. It's that person for a particular reason. It comes out of their whole unique ongoingness in some way, whatever that is, their life elaboration, their life up until that moment, and what carries them forward into the next moment in some way. But in terms of practice, I'm wondering, well, first of all, did you ever, coming across Gendlin, did you ever have an interest in, or maybe you did get involved in the focusing world in any way, in communities or workshops, or meet up with other focusing people?
No, I didn't. And there's an element of regret in me.
Okay.
And then also, I mean, maybe almost like I could wonder about why not. Um, and I think the reason, I mean, I did have a great interest in meeting uh, Gene, but it's sort of my life didn't come together that way because I practiced monastically, and if you want, we can talk about what that meant. But it's a long period, and not that I was locked away, but it's just like there was a different orientation in my life. But I would say underneath it is actually a certain kind of reluctance and resistance to focusing as a method. Like I never felt a strong need to learn it properly, teach it, understand it more. I was always more intrigued actually by Gendlin's philosophical work and his reassessing of certain terms and invention of new terms that were describing for me vital processes that I felt I was already intimate with. So yeah, it's unresolved. It is a little bit of a regret. I don't know a better word, and since like that this is like there are missed opportunities, and then also a certain sense of freedom and not getting sucked into some other, you know, way of thinking and community and playing by new rules and
So I'm curious, where did your practice take you?
where did my practice take me? You mean my Zen practice or my
Well,
life?
yeah, well, somehow you got into Zen.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious the direction you took, sort of how that was right for you.
Yeah. Maybe there too, it's useful for me to reflect on kind of like what's the context out of which it arose, because there's something surprising for me, even, just looking back at my life. It's like I wasn't looking for a spiritual practice. I wasn't like spiritually inclined. I'm quite uh skeptical of religion and like I have not much interest in metaphysics or so. It's curious to me that there's an aspect of my life where I put on robes and sit in front of people and talk about, you know, what other people experience as spiritual teachings. So it's a little weird. But the origin of my spiritual practice is really in a sense of depression. And I use that word, and I don't use it, I'm not pretending I'm using it in a clinical way or in a diagnostic way. Uh, there was a sense of not being fully alive.
Mhm.
And it's a period of like 5 years in my life of feeling less than fully engaged and held back in a way. And there's a kind of strange, for me, hard to grasp underlying fear, and it bothered me tremendously. I mean, it's just like it just bothered me. Very disturbing. Because on the surface of my life, things were, fine. I mean, I had a satisfying social life and partner, and I was like, I guess, nominally successful in what I was doing, and academically, but it just didn't feel fulfilling. Okay, so I felt like I had to pause with this, and my way of pausing was to leave Germany and go to San Francisco for a year. This was like, and I literally had the sense of like, I'm just pausing, and I just used an academic exchange program to get somewhere else and pause. Right. And there was something that was continuing. It was an interest in developing, how would we call this, like body awareness and sensitivity. So I was engaged with various like practices that were centered on feeling myself better.
Mhm.
And I was living with someone like in a shared housing situation, and she said, "Well, I'm going to this place sometimes, you want to come?" And like they have, a talk, and because I just didn't have anything better to do, so I said, "Yeah, I'll come." And it was a Zendo, and I entered, and I got some minimal instruction. Like if I gave this instruction today, I have developed a different language. It was like, invite your spine into uprightness, you know, sit with an open heart, and bring attention to the sensations of breathing. They didn't say that, but that's what I would say today. Um, and I did that, and something happened. I mean, I felt like something fell off, and I felt what I'm now calling unapologetically alive. Just like just like this. So it made a big impression on me. And then there was also an affinity to this Zen aesthetic, just like feeling at home in this aesthetic. It was a very aesthetic decision. It's like, well, this is like a no frills approach to life, nothing extra. That was just suiting my personality. And I understand that that's not like for everyone, but it was, it was a good, um, yeah, aesthetic. I mean, aesthetics carry a lot. It's
Yeah.
like they carry a lot of postural, mm, yeah, what knowing. Like, so anyway, uh, I I just continued because this experience was so profound. And and it cured my depression, which was like, wow, that's nice. It's like, that's nice. And I've understood over the years of making more sense of what's happening when you sit in a certain way and practice a certain kind of mental posture, that I was shying away from intensity, bodily intensity. bodily felt intensity. We can, I think we can, as human beings, we can shy away from unpleasant, painful intensity, and we can also shy away from pleasant intensity. And so depression for me was a kind of, defensive, protective posture. And I had to learn to realize that. And little by little, notice the many layers of resistance to intensity that had, I don't know, it's hard to say where stuff comes from, build up, or, you born with this stuff, or is there some intergenerational thing going on? I don't know. But it's there. And you kind of have to deal with it. If you don't deal with it, you're not fully alive.
Yeah.
So, but also then the Zen Buddhist discourse that I've encountered started to, I just had a feeling like, wow, this is speaking in a way that makes sense to me. Like maybe for the first time, getting me out of this idea that I had to figure out life in some sort of conceptual, philosophical way, therapeutic way. And Buddhism just sort of laid it out for me in a way. I mean, what I heard was like, yeah, that makes sense. It's very pragmatic. It's about liberation from suffering, wisdom, and compassion. Yeah, that matters to me. So let's do this.
You use the term mental postures. I'm curious. I don't understand what that means.
Yeah, maybe another word you could use there is view or frame, like a mental frame or a view that you hold that structures a lot. Behavior, thoughts, approaches to life. So I like the word posture here because, like a physical posture that implies a lot, there are mental postures that imply a lot, and that, for example, I mean, I use the term maybe in a too generous way. It's not actually that clearly defined because I think it sort of touches into something that people do understand intuitively. But we could say it makes a difference whether you come from a posture of gratitude or a posture of complaint. That would be an example, right? It's like, so is it useful to switch from a posture of complaint to a posture of gratitude? Yeah, for many people, that's really will be an important change. I look at teachings as antidotes. So if you are not mired in a dysfunctional posture of complaint, then there's nothing wrong with complaining now and then, But if you've made it your posture, it's very limiting. If you make then gratitude your posture and you try to be grateful for everything, in an exaggerated way, then maybe the teaching would be, why don't you start complaining a little bit? Yeah, but yeah, like that. Postures are also something that a place you usually come from.
I was curious because of the term posture, and I wasn't sure if it was more like that kind of psychological stance or if it was more concretely a posture in the body.
Well, it alludes to that because my basic view is that body and mind are not separate, they're undivided. We can experience them separately, but fundamentally they're undivided. So to speak about a mental posture is already mixing body and mind, which I think is a welcome, complication or provocation, depending on where people are with this kind of inquiry of like, well, what about body and mind? They separate, related,
Mhm.
not one, not two.
So in your own trajectory, you kind of stumbled across Zen practice. It sounds like quite a profound impact on you as a person. There's things that you liked about the tradition that appealed to you.
Mhm.
Um, and at some point then, rather than it simply being your practice or of personal benefit, you took it further and decided to actually make it a part of your life as a teacher.
Yeah, well, I can't say that was a decision. It's like it's just something I grew into, because I, as much as possible, I don't look at myself as a teacher. I mean, if I have to put something on a website and say I'm the resident or guiding teacher of the Boulder Zen Center or something, but I think it's very useful for me to look at the activity that I'm engaged in. And the activity that I'm engaged in, I would describe as I'm sharing my practice with others. And I grew into that. It's like some people benefit from being, say they're benefiting or coming back for this kind of sharing. So then I've learned to say yes to that and say like, yeah, okay, seems like that's useful to some people, so I'll do it. But I would say, if that if that stopped to be the case, I
Mhm.
would cease to be a teacher, and probably it would be good to stop.
But it sounds like the way that you teach, it is a continuation of your practice in a way.
Yeah, I mean, if I want to place this more in Western um, terms and contexts, and maybe also connected with Gendlin, he doesn't use that term, but I see myself as a phenomenologist. Right? It's like I'm studying experience.
Mhm.
And what I found frustrating in Western phenomenology is that it's mostly descriptive. It describes what we find when we observe experience. And what I found, what Buddhism brought, which was revelatory to me, is like Buddhism also is a phenomenology, but it is a transformative phenomenology. And what I mean by that is it never divorces itself from the idea of transformation and in the direction of liberation from suffering, wisdom, and compassion. It doesn't pretend to be a science at all.
Mhm.
It doesn't leave out the normative. And I think our living process is that way, where we can't leave out the normative. Like our being is wanting to unfold in the direction of liberation, wisdom, and compassion. So I just didn't find that in Western philosophical approaches much. And there's just, I think, in the West there's psychotherapy that is doing that, and that's why Buddhism and psychotherapy can talk to each other, because they're both transformative phenomenologies. And then Gendlin occupies a special place in that, and then also in my heart, because even though he doesn't describe it that way himself, he clearly is a transformative, he practices transformative phenomenology, right? So, um, so in some sense, I could have just as well ended up in the focusing world, as you called it,
Mhm.
not in Zen Buddhism. And sometimes I fantasize that God, I maybe I could just strip myself of the, you know, aspects of Zen that I also find kind of cumbersome and weird and like, but then I'm very pragmatic. It's like it allows for something that is not present. It's like when I watch Gendlin videos, let's say, right? And his like stubborn insistence that he's not talking about the ultimate or spiritual practice, or that he wants intentionally a secular context in which people don't feel alienated. So it just appears like he's there as this secular person. Right? It appeals to me. I like it. But it also leaves something out. There's a context, and when you frame something as explicitly spiritual, you take all the vestiges of it, I don't take all of them, but, some. Something else is possible. A sacredness can appear like it did for me, when I first entered this Zendo and had this experience, and then I had other experiences along the way that I don't think are invited in the same way in other contexts. So from that point of view, I'm respecting what I've done all these years, decades even. And I have a hard time just, throwing it overboard and say like, oh God, this is just like hocus pocus or something, because it's not.
Yeah.
There is an element of embodiment and what I think is even more important, of mutual embodiment in ritual that is absent from like how I imagine a focusing conference.
Yeah, definitely. Well, there are some rituals, but they you participate or don't and resist at the same time.
Yeah, okay.
But I think well, I want to respond to some of the things you've been saying. One is, I think focusing can also be taught in that way as a continuation of practice
Mhm.
rather than leaping from the practice into something else called teaching.
Yeah.
So I think there's that commonality potentially. I also would see focusing as a kind of the term that I would use as process phenomenology. Uh,
Mhm.
and by that, it has this transformative or therapeutic uh, effect, even if that's not the intention. If the intention is simply to describe experience, experience in response to being described, if you're in touch with the experience, is it has this tendency to move forward and to try to transform or do something therapeutic to the person that's engaged in it, I would say. That would be my way of saying it.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's I fully agree, because there's this one, I mean, in the focusing process, there's this crucial uh moment. And maybe there's more vocabulary than I've learned, but what I've understood as what the felt shift is, right? This shift implies something normative. It implies rightness.
Yes.
So it's not just accidental that it also has a transformative effect. The process itself implies or feeds on, is dependent on, and goes for rightness.
Yeah, I would agree with
Because
that.
otherwise, it's actually your experience. Otherwise, is that you're stuck.
Yeah, it's not an accident that the process at least tends towards something more, something more that has this right feeling to it, this more life, this expansiveness, or something like that. That's not an accident. That's for some reason, that's what life does. But
Yeah,
it is I think it's easier if you don't go in pushing for that. I think it's more likely to happen if you take that as a moment of grace or something like that, that life comes if it's given enough space and it brings this next step. It brings a shift in the body. To be focusing, looking for a shift, I think, is more difficult. That's what I meant, in that it's accidental in that respect. It's almost like a side effect of being with yourself under certain conditions, maybe.
Yeah, okay.
But I want to get to the last thing that you were talking about. The thing that you're saying, I think you could yet end up in the focusing community.
Yeah. I feel that, yeah.
I want to say, I mean, Gendlin was so careful all the time, and this is exactly what you've spotted. He was always so careful not to stray very much at all into the spiritual territory. And if he did, he would immediately undermine it in some ways so as not to get identified with any kind of tradition or whatever. I think his intention was to keep that all open for anyone that came in with their own spiritual interest or whatever. I think that's one side of it. I think the other side of it is that maybe Gendlin, and maybe this is commonly felt in the focusing world to some extent, that there's a wariness around community. And I think a huge value is placed on community, but at the same time, there's a wariness of what community can do to the individual, how to keep alive in some way your own fullness as a person while being engaged in community, that there's that tension that I think focusing people are very aware of. And I'm sure a lot of other people are also aware of that. But if you came in with your interests and you wanted to develop in a spiritual way, I would imagine your focusing practice would take you there. And that would, without any of the accoutrements of a spiritual practice, you would find yourself in a spiritual practice.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Yeah.
I don't know the focusing world, so when I don't think about it much. It's just like I may have some the things you just said, and there's a felt sense that arises from that, and maybe some speculation, and yeah.
Yeah.
But let me start in a kind of in a different place. One of the things that I feel like I've done through my Zen practice is studying attention.
Mhm.
And I've come to make a simple distinction between focus and field. Focused attention and field-like attention. And when I say focus and field here, it has nothing to do immediately with focusing. It's just this is a coincidence. I really just mean this as a technical term, as attention can be focused or it can be widened and become field-like.
Hmm.
Now, these are sort of modes in which attention can function. And we could maybe also say, well, maybe attention is on a spectrum from very focused to, being completely field-like. What I mean by field is you are aware. Awareness is a word that I'm using for field-like attention, aware of everything all at once and nothing in particular. Whereas when your attention is focused, you are aware of something particular and you are almost discarding other aspects of the field. So now back to focusing. Focusing is doing something with focused attention. So the name is somewhat appropriate because I'm noticing a felt sense and I'm deciding and make a certain effort. And sometimes it takes quite an effort, in my experience, to stay with that particular felt sense, that particular intricacy, that particular situation that is present for me in this felt sense. Okay. In order to do that, now it's the attention as a field awareness is implied. We could say it's in the background.
Exactly. Yeah.
Now, the reason I think a therapist can be so helpful in a focusing process is because a therapist can hold the field for me if I'm not quite able to do it. And the therapist holds an open space, the field, and can also help me to regain focus. It's like, oh, my mind strays and I get, well, what about, coming back to that feeling that you called such and such? So sometimes I think when focusing is described too much as a method, whatever too much means here, we can explore that. Too much as a method, it emphasizes focused attention and doesn't really notice the field, the space, the nothing in particular awareness in which all of this happens.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then something more happens if you employ, and you said something to that extent, if you want a felt shift. If you employ the focusing process to solve a problem of whatever kind, it becomes instrumentalized. And what Zen practice is for me that is quite in contrast to focusing is there is a constant invitation to rest in the field, to practice, to just practice openness. Just practice openness. Just practice that. So then it's not that no content arises in that openness. Quite the contrary. Contents do arise. But interestingly there's a satisfaction that comes from just resting in the field, which is actually, even if you have problems, because you're not focusing them, you can have an experience of like, nothing's missing, everything's okay. Now, I take this one step further, and then I'm curious what you think. A focusing process used too much as a method, right, disregards in a way, implicitly, it doesn't want to do that, but it does so implicitly, that not all problems need to be solved. And that I can be quite liberated and content with having a whole bunch of problems. Mm-hmm. In a strange and important discovery can be made there. It's like these problems belong to my process. And that's okay. Not just okay. It's like I deserve these problems. Now, when I use the word deserve there, it's like I'm using it in a new way, like in a Gendlin, that's a new deserving. It doesn't mean like I'm wishing problems on people, but I can discover for myself that it is my job to have these problems. And yeah, I would just say that, to have them.
Mhm.
Because that is the way it is. And that has something to do with what we said previously about self. That also is part and parcel of myself. And to find a kind of resolution with that, rather than a struggle that something needs to be healed or changed, or, I have to go to therapy with this. There's some fundamental ease that could come with just resting in the field with everything that belongs to it, including all these problems that are quite disturbing and bothersome, but nonetheless,
Mhm.
here I am. And focusing, as much as I've benefited from it, has not like directed me there, but Zen practice has.
That's so interesting to me because I've spoken to I mean, the focusing world's full of people that are also in the Buddhist world. And I think it makes a lot of sense that that is the case. But I've always been interested in exactly this point. What is it that the Buddhist world or the spiritual practice, as you're describing it, adds to focusing, or how does it take a different turn or something like that, or have a different emphasis? So I'm glad we're talking about this. The first thing I would say, I feel like as a psychotherapist and psychologist, I feel like saying, let's get them off the table. Because I think we can probably discuss it just with the more usual focusing setup where there's a focuser and a listener. And most focusing is done with simply a listener there, giving their presence, reflecting back to the focuser, assisting the focuser to stay with their experience. And that tends to be a very helpful setup, because just the presence of a person, even if they say nothing, already makes the experience more alive. As we spoke about earlier, because there isn't a separation, there's already something happening there. But when you were making the distinction between focused awareness and the field, I wanted to say in focusing, we have both. And I think you would agree with that if I say a little bit more, but it's a little bit different, I think, than where you took it. In order to focus, you have the felt sense, like right now I can feel something in my chest. I could bring my focus to that and have the more focused attention you're talking about, where I really let myself feel that. And the felt sense, in response to my attention, it becomes a little bit more present, and I could stay with it and see where it takes me. It's also true that in focusing, we would often say to ourselves or to another person focusing, see if it's okay just to give that some space and to really feel more of the field around the felt sense, and to have both at once. That the space or the field, as you're saying, is an important stance or experiential perspective or a wider sense of being or something from which to pay attention to something more specific that then temporarily becomes an object in your awareness that you can watch it. One thing I would say is that I wouldn't say as a focuser I'm out to solve problems, or as a psychotherapist. I would say I'm investing myself in the other's discovery, that to simply be with their sense of something, if you can be with it in this spacious way that I think we're both sort of describing, the felt sense of its own accord begins to do something. And from that bodily processing, insights, images, words tend to arise from the experiencing. They don't always, but there's a tendency for that to happen. So rather than trying to solve problems, we simply keep company with what is there as a problem, and it solves itself if you have enough of the field there. For me, that's an important distinction. But the thing that I really like in what, I mean, I like a lot of what you're saying, but the thing that I really like in what you're saying is the last bit, because that is something that I think in focusing we rarely do, and I think would be a really interesting thing to incorporate. Often we bring attention to something, and we don't really pay much attention to the attention itself. There's something about the broader field that is really exciting. And I think, as you say, it tends to usually be in the background. That difference in what's foregrounded in attention, I think that's a fascinating thing to me.
Yeah. Yeah, and then where it becomes a spiritual dimension is, in Gendlin, I find, he can say something that sounds like phenomenological descriptiveness, right? The body is the situation.
Mhm.
Okay. This contains a lot. It contains the noticing of undividedness.
Mhm.
There's a difference between intellectually contemplating undividedness and resting in it as a kind of ease. It's like struggle ends. There's no struggle. It all belongs to the field. And it's also there where, the edges of the self sort of fray, and you'd still have this sense that, it's me who has to take care of things, I have to eat and I have to pay my bills, or it seems that way. But some deeper sense of belonging, to the world,
Mm-hmm.
despite all its problems.
Yeah.
Right? That's the spiritual dimension. And yeah, and it's like, it has something to do with, yeah, we could use that, foregrounding the field. And then also in some kind of intention, not forceful, but a willingness, maybe, openness to just resting in it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, then this sounds like, I think on the surface, if we're just looking at it intellectually, it can sound like passivity, it's like, oh, you're just accepting everything, you don't do anything, you're just sitting, you're just letting it happen. It's a shift of emphasis. It's an antidote to struggle and feeling like something isn't quite right. And even if you reframe it the way, like, what does the problem want to do? There's still like lingering feelings of it's not quite right. Something needs to, change, be better. Hopefully, I'm not gonna focus on it. We'll see, invite it, and just all kinds of little ways one can get caught in this.
Mm-hmm.
But now, if we shift and say we're resting in the field, we're allowing it to be just the way it is, struggle subsides, there's ease. And then maybe if we think about it, our fear is, oh, then the inaction results from that. No, but it does invite now the kind of spontaneity that you are invoking too. It's like what wants to happen.
Mm-hmm.
The field is now very open for something to happen.
Yeah.
So then do you let yourself be drawn into something and then just do that? And then I think all these mechanisms of a process phenomenology are completely in action.
The question that arises for me as I think what I'm following what you're saying is what might be different in focusing, but I'm not sure, is two things that are linked. One is in that, if you want to call it field of awareness, I'm happy calling it that, resting in that to some extent in order to focus, maybe, or maybe not in order to focus, in order to just have that. Gendlin, talks a lot about clearing a space and having that cleared space. They can be very expansive.
Mm-hmm.
Within that cleared space, that open awareness, that field of awareness, if I notice something that arises within that, I may notice an issue in my life that has a felt sense that comes quite quickly. Or another way of saying it is, I notice how I'm carrying something in my life, that's a part of what arises in that open field. In focusing there, you would, as you would have a relationship with that. It is very relational in that you bring some degree of sort of non-judgmental caring. It's a phenomenological attitude with a degree of warmth or something.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one thing, is that the relational dimension, where that might fit in the more spiritual aspect you're talking about. The other thing is that when you bring that kind of relationship, as we were talking about before, then there's process. That in that field, nothing just stays as it is.
Mm-hmm.
If you pay attention to it, it sort of almost takes on a life of its own or a consciousness of its own or something, and begins to move itself in particular ways.
Mm-hmm.
So the aspect of relationship and the aspect of process, I'm wondering how they fit in the more spiritual practice that you're describing, or do they fit?
Yeah, I mean that's good. A good lead into voicing my appreciation for focusing and how it's never left. Like it held my interest, right? Because the danger in what I'm describing of like, well, you just rest in the field is that we skip over, and I think Gendlin has articulated that somewhere too, of there can be a fantasy of being able to skipping over the personal. Like, would you just go to this like transpersonal field like experience, and then you can pretend to yourself that personal issues and personal development are second rate or would happen automatically. And I don't believe that, and that's why I keep introducing the idea of felt sense to my students. It's like there's something vital there, and there's a lot of information, and we don't want to skip over that and sort of like say, oh yeah, there's just some body sensations there, whatever, let's go back to the field. So
Could I say something?
I think that's, yeah, go ahead.
I want to just pick up the other side of that. I appreciate that you're not wanting students to skip over things that actually need to process themselves, or however you want to say that. I want to say the opposite in the focusing world, that the thing that I'm concerned about that can at times happen in the focusing world is that the focused attention is actually too narrow.
Yeah, yeah.
And it happens within not the field of awareness you're talking about, but it happens within the person's pre-existing biases and understandings, and all of those things give the felt sense a very narrow space within which to change only in accordance with how it's allowed to change, almost, if you could say it that way. That what we maybe need in the focusing world is a little more attention on appreciation of that slightly more meditative, or at least more expansive space. Spending a bit more time making sure that that is there before developing relationship with whatever else is there.
Yeah, I think I think you pointed out a complementarity, and I see all teachings as antidotal. So for Zen Buddhism, when it is starting to get stuck in this field, like in this expansive awareness, focusing is a good antidote. It's like let's not disregard these processes and say like, oh, they're just psychological or something. Or now you're focusing on a self that really doesn't exist or something. And then the way you just said it is like in the focusing world, that can be exactly the opposite. You could use an antidotal teaching there, which I think in your presentation was already present. And it's like, oh, like if you bring the mental posture of not trying to get to somewhere, right, but hold back from that intentionally and bring in an openness and basically ask what wants to be focused on, what wants, and once that happens, what step wants to come. I mean, Gendlin says it all the time. You have to let it come. You can't make it come. Nonetheless, the human mind is tricky there. It's like we know that, and it's a constant. Oh, I want too much, so I need to let it go. Right? So.
Yeah, that's where the presence of a listener can be very useful, because a listener can notice where the focuser has adopted some kind of agenda rather than that more openness, and simply reflect that back in a way that the focuser then has this invitation to rest back into this greater openness and not try to do anything.
Now, let me say something there too, that just this might be just a kind of weird bias that I have. As much as I appreciate, how much teachers and fellow practitioners have helped me in my process, I still hold some sort of ideal that my practice is not divorced from my daily life. And there should be, ideally should, I don't know, but there's some kind of ideal that a certain organic and spontaneous process of staying in touch with the complexity of my life situation that is enfolded, implied, implicit in, or present as, like sometimes I talk about it, implexity, like the body has enfolded the complexity of the situation and it carries it as an implexity. Now, if you can organically sort of be with that implexity, your action and speaking and unfolds, and it would be nice, right, if that wasn't dependent on someone listening to you, processing.
Yeah. So
there's a need. I'm just recognizing a need in me to be able to hold the field myself.
Yeah, I totally agree.
But how is this like in a learning process, while you could sort of use someone else to hold the field for you for a while, what is the practice that empowers you and teaches you and gets you familiar with holding the field for yourself in a reliable way? in here is in Zen practice something that I think is only sort of tangentially addressed in focusing. Our minds get in the way.
Mhm.
There's a lot of discursive thinking going on that actually rattles along in these already charted, pathways of like what we expect from life, and our mind tries to like rehashes this all the time. So Zen practice specifically is watch your thoughts come and go. They come and you learn over, for most people, over many years to not identify with your thoughts. And this is a specific practice that when I started focusing as a self-taught person, it's like, oh, this clearing the space is not, that's a pretty advanced practice already, just to like find enough silence in your mind to notice the various things that are going on and recognizing what has most prevalence or importance. And, if your mind is so busy that you're just like, have so much thought traffic,
Mhm.
that already is hard, right? So I have benefited just from a dedicated practice of noticing thoughts, taking attention, bringing it back to the body, until it can stay in the body effortlessly.
I'm aware of time. I promised it was going to be an hour and we've gone over time. But I want to respond to what you've said because it also feels important to me that I think what you're saying is that you're not satisfied if the practice, as you understand it, remains in sort of, I could say in a slightly dismissive way, sort of more rarefied places and doesn't show up in the person's actual living day to day. I would feel the same about focusing, that if it's only restricted to focusing sessions, that's not really enough from my point of view. To not bring focusing into your life and actually have it impact the way you relate to other people, the way you live, the way you understand your responses to nature or anything else that's happening for you, to use it also to, sort through difficulties, like in your work situation or something, a problem occurs and you have a bodily felt response to it. If focusing to just right there and then be able to let your attention go down there. And even in relationship to your boss, for example, sometimes it's safe enough to actually process it. In terms of the thoughts that can be a real distraction and hindrance, I don't think there's a very good answer to that. The one thing that I would say is, again, relationally, there are people often in a person's life that that's somebody I can talk to about something that really matters to me. Because in talking to them, you understand yourself better. There's something about their way of listening to you, maybe their way of not interrupting, of just kind of giving you some space that allows you, because you're in relationship to them, to get beyond all of the interference that often comes when you're just with yourself. The relational aspect, I think, is an important part of the focusing practice. But I also agree with you that being able to focus on your own is a really important, not only resource that diminishes it too much, it's an important way of being. And learning how to focus alone is something that we don't emphasize as much in the focusing world. I mean, Gendlin's first book was all about that. A lot of it was about that. And that's where I first learned focusing. And I first learned it on my own. To do it with a listener or in a community was a second step for me, and not always better, although sometimes better.
Mhm.
I would, again, I think that your emphasis on the spiritual practice you're describing is worth importing aspects of that back into the focusing world. makes sense to me.
All right. But maybe it's not importing back. Maybe it's carrying forward.
Yeah. I guess it is carrying forward, but it's also reviving something in the tradition that isn't emphasized much anymore.
Well, there's something really rich in Gendlin's intentional way of, as you said earlier, keeping it open, not tying it to something. Also avoiding any kind of cliches between East and West, and
Yeah.
recognizing that there's something here that is really powerful and in a way new and belongs to our current cultural evolution too. And I think for me, Zen Buddhism needs to evolve, or I think, I mean, I'm studying texts from the 13th century, and they have a lot of interesting things that actually we just talked about in our own language. But this need for being in touch with ourselves, if we want to circle back, like an authenticity in this wider sense, is not something that I'm finding, say, in my lineage, Dogen talking about. It's like it's not of no concern to him, seemingly. I mean, he's not bringing it up. But he talks about undivided activity. He says how we are, not separate from anything that surrounds us, the entire cosmos. So how to bring those two concerns and needs together, again, a more existential dimension of, this, how you're existentially situated in the world, and then also a dimension of personal processing that is also undivided from that existential situatedness. In actual fact, in my view, it is expressed that way. Like we're expressing this wholeness through our personal activity, right? So it's really in that sense, whatever we have here now, we're just talking about, because it's our practices, focusing and Zen Buddhism. It's like how to, in a very open way, notice what is at play phenomenologically without getting stuck in a particular language. And like, I think we've done a good job, right? It's like we are in the same territory. We can use language in new ways and try to sort this out for ourselves and for our time.
Yeah. No, I think that's really beautifully said. Thank you very much. I have really appreciated this, and I hope that there's some way that we can maintain some connection, and maybe between our communities as well.
Yeah, I would like that. Let's explore it. And yeah, I do respond to invitations. So.
Okay.
And just, you and I can stay in touch. I would enjoy that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I would enjoy that too. Thank you very much. I really appreciate this conversation.
Yeah, great conversation. I appreciate it too.
Okay. Thank you very much. See you. Bye for now.
Bye.